Old Testament, a lot of heavy stuff. Genesis, beautiful in many ways. A lot of prophet stories, a lot of just scandals, I would say, a lot of violence, a lot of events where you look at the character of God and you say, is God vindictive? Is God angry? Is God personal? And we can take examples, but just the overarching theme of the Old Testament in terms of the character of God and the events of the Old Testament. Why do you think it's relevant to study them? And why do you think they should be part of our faith? Because again, yes, they do explain the story, but how do I approach that scripture? And yes, there's historical context. Yes, there was an event in history that was taking place, but really this is where God gets a bad rap. I just want to be honest. Like, this is where people look at the character of God and say, how? This is a lot for a lot of seekers. This could be in 2025 where people are more secular than anything else. This for like, yeah, it doesn't really land with their progressive moral worldview, but also it's like, yeah, they might be missing something in those stories because maybe they haven't done this in-depth reading and researching. So what do you have to say for that, just Old Testament piece in general?
Yeah, I think the first question of, why should we care about the Old Testament? I think the clearest answer is that Jesus cared about the Old Testament. These were the scriptures Jesus had memorized as a kid. These were the scriptures he was referencing in the Sermon on the Mount and filling them to their God's desired completion. These are, these were on his tongue with his disciples all the time. This is how his disciples later understood the meaning of his death and resurrection, thinking back to the prophecies, thinking back to the stories, the way that God worked with the prophets, the way that he chose Abraham, not because of the good things Abraham had done. Abraham was a pagan. God elected and chose Abraham out of the many so that through the one he would bring blessing to nations. And it was an act of grace. It was not something that Abraham had earned. All of these things are rooted in the Old Testament, concepts of grace, mercy, forgiveness, justice. And so if we just read the New Testament, we're leaving behind the whole foundation to the house, right?
Right.
And just focusing on the fun parts of the house that we like the TV on the wall or whatever,
right.
And so there's, the Old Testament is an adventure, and it's maybe not a coincidence that most of the narrative in the Old Testament is adventure. It's wondering, it's questioning when something is going to happen, even though there's a promise for it, and you have an all-powerful God who could bring it about anytime, but you're stuck kind of wondering when, and things don't look like they're going to work out, and then they do, and then you have periods of silence, and it speaks to the reality of the human experience in a way that I think no other religious text does.
Wow.
Now, I haven't read every religious text. That would be quite the claim. But the Quran is very different, and it has different purposes. It's written for a different purpose than the Bible is. But the Bible is very unique in both the narrative, the fact that it is speaking in narrative, but also what the narrative is specifically speaking to, and the reality of humanity embodied in Israel and God's purposes for all nations and peoples. And so I think first approaching it as, number one, you have to approach it, if you're being genuine, you have to approach it for what it is. It is an ancient book. There's a saying in biblical scholarship, I heard it from a scholar named John Walton, but he loves to remind his students that the Bible was not written to us, but it was preserved for us. And so since it was not written to us, who was it written to? It was written to a specific type of people in a specific place in a specific time period, and they were in a different culture than we were. And just like how I think about how we picture you have a daughter in school right now, right? And she's in 5th grade, 4th grade,
Fourth grade.
4th grade. She acts like a 5th grader. That's why she acts like a high schooler. But and so it's her teacher's jobs. Let's say she had one teacher from 4th grade to 12th grade. Okay. It's that teacher's job to help her get to a place where in 12th grade she's ready for the next step, right? And so let's say that 12th grade step is AP Calculus getting an A. So is that teacher going to show up next Monday with an AP Calculus book and give that to your daughter and say, let's start working through this now? She would be a bad teacher if she did that, because there's so many things that you have to learn in order to get to that place. That teacher, what she's going to do is she's going to meet your daughter where she's at in her place and time. She's going to work with what she's got to get her where she wants to go. And this is what I see going on through so much of Scripture, is that we have had the benefit in the past 20 years of learning more about other what is called ancient Near East people groups, that Israel was not the only ancient Near Easterners at that time. And you know that from a cursory reading of Scripture, that there's peoples all over the place, and they have different gods, they have different rituals and practices. And by analyzing the best reliable Old Testament texts we have that even date back before Jesus, to analyzing stones and inscriptions and letters that were written in the context of these other ancient Near Eastern people groups, we can learn that they all, as would be expected, they all had certain ideas about the world, about they had opinions about, some common things, like the two worst things in their ancient Near Eastern mind was death and disorder. We understand death, but we don't really think about disorder being something that's really on our minds. And part of that is because in the Western context, we live in a world where everything is really put together pretty well. I mean, you drive with stoplights, you have clocks, you have schedules, everything is pretty ordered. But back then they were dealing, a lot of these ancient empires, people were dealing with a lot of disorder. They didn't have great regulations, laws. People just did what they wanted to, and natural disasters would hit without any planning or ways to mitigate the negative consequences of those. And so that was on the forefront of all of their minds. And so you see disorder being a consistent theme in a lot of stories of creation that are in other ancient Near Eastern texts, stories of the flood that are in other ancient Near Eastern texts. And so you kind of get a better grasp of how did these people think about the world. And not to say that we in the 21st century are any better than them. We have more information now. I think they were probably smarter back then than we are now, thinking about how they built certain things and did all that they did without the technology that we have now. But from a morality standpoint, I think it would be hard to find anyone who would disagree that we are in a better moral place in the world now than they were back then. And there's a lot of historians like Tom Holland who would say that that is largely due to Christian influence and Christian ethics. But all that to say, from a morality standpoint, I think that it seems clear to me, and there's evidence of how Jesus interacted with his disciples and references that he made to the Old Testament when he was alive on earth, is that those people were in their fourth grade chairs. And God was being a good teacher, not shaming them for being, not shaming them for like, why don't you get this AP calculus? Like you should get this by now.
Right.
He was meeting them where they were at, and in their culture that was characterized primarily by violence and takeover, and even sacrificial worship common across the ancient Near East. He's meeting them where they're at, not only to take them where he wants to go, but to enable them, like the sacrificial system, that enabled them to understand the love of God, the height, width, and depth of his love that he would go in order to be a burnt offering, to be the sacrifice that they were sacrificing twice a day because of their continual and frequent sins. This is how they understood what Jesus accomplished. And so I think that those things are important to remember as anyone approaches it, that there is a sense of progressive revelation, and the hard things that you read in Scripture does not highlight, it doesn't highlight deficiencies in the character of God. It highlights the deficiencies in the character of man. That is where man was at, and God was meeting them where they were.
Over and over again, I feel, and it's really like, in the past I used to think that Israel were the chosen people of God, as in, they were special, but I came to realize that they were just like the showcase of humanity to the rest of history on how broken our nature is. So they were a people group that God chose to work with to bring redemption and to showcase even the ones that God is working so intimately with are still rebelling, are still going and worshiping idols and worshiping other gods, are still killing prophets, are still doing all these things. And like, the end of that story of, I always say the Bible starts with the first two humans kill one another. So this is what God had to start with. If you were to say like, this is our beginning, the first two humans, the born on earth, if you will, the first kill the other. So this is our starting moral point. And from that to maybe, like you said, where we are today, just from a moral standpoint, it's a huge thing. Now, secular people would credit humanity with that. It's like, look at us, we're just civilized and we're evolved. And there are elements to that because, yes, we did use a lot of what God gave us to evolve, but ultimately it's not us who are getting us to where we are. And you said about access to technology and information versus smart ancient people. I really think that because we have accessibility, such AI, internet, just that ability to search and research and do qualitative research, I think it puts a huge accountability in front of God to our generation. Like, when God sits with me and asks me, what have you done to seek that truth earnestly, it's going to be very different than asking a person that was there 1,000 years ago, because they didn't have ChatGPT. They didn't have YouTube. Different scholars. They didn't have the Bible even translated in different languages. They were just, it was so different. So for us to reach that point, it took a lot